One thing about heavier music that crosses my mind is that we've been really spoiled with great guitarists in the past. When we were growing up, all we ever heard were the greatest guitarists on the planet, and that's because they were the only ones that were being marketed to us, because they were obviously great. You couldn't even really get into a studio or afford a recording budget unless you were being backed by a label at that time. But that's just not the same scenario these days. You can be a terrible guitar player, have a Scarlett interface, record videos with your iPhone, and pay a couple $100 for ads to be seen by tons of people. And I think the accessibility of affordable gear and recording means that we've been left with getting sent tracks from lackluster players all the time. I'll even throw myself under the bus. A lot of the time, I know during mixing, I can take my terrible guitar playing and get it to sound like this. But what we're gonna be focused on here is finding a way to keep a consistent sounding guitar track. Well, by the end of this video, my friends, you'll be able to take a lackluster performance and make something out of it. So what's happening, fam? Miami here with JST, and I've never considered myself a great guitar player. Like ever. But because of that and the fact that I was surrounded by some of the greatest guitar players, I had to figure out how to make my guitar track sound really mean. And that's not an easy task when you barely pick up a guitar sometimes and barely practice your runs and scales. Well, let's get into some ways to save yourself in this situation. 1. Using a transient designer on the guitar. The problem with most inconsistent DI signals is the sharp transient information associated with a good strike of a note isn't present, and that leads to a lack of definition. This makes me reach for something like Transify because it's usually in the mids or high mids that you need to have a sharper sound when it comes to guitar. Now, I've done this before and after the amp, but for the sake of this example, we're gonna use it after the amp. And this is an option for people that already have an amped guitar track and still aren't getting the clarity that they need. This will work better on leads than it will on rhythms, and if need be, you can put it before the amp, but I think there's an even better option for that, and I'll get to that in a minute. But listen to how much of a difference using a transient designer on a performance can make. Now, if that doesn't make you a believer, then I don't know what's going to. It completely changed the consistency of that lead riff and made it sound like it was being played by somebody else. But that gets us into our second point of this video. Proper picking technique. Yeah, this is obviously the greatest option, right? Correcting it at the source. I just wanted to make sure that I didn't forget to mention this because everything else in this video that we're doing is going to be a band-aid for improper picking technique. You want to make sure that you're striking it to get the proper chirp, but also you should take this advice from an actual guitarist. Make sure to check out this video by Jeff Loomis explaining how to have proper picking technique. Obviously, he's going to explain it to you way better than I, and after watching this myself, I really noticed a difference in my playability. So on to the next topic. Number 3, putting a clipper or limiter before the amplifier. Now, this is an idea that I got from a Joey session a long time ago. It was with this band Vesta Collide, and they were using guitars with active pickups that were so hot, it was clipping the signal on the way in. But the main point that I noticed is that he didn't need a tube screamer after which he typically uses. It's like the signal was made consistent by how hot the input was. So what would be the difference from just chopping off some of those peaks with a clipper? And that gave me the idea to use JST Maximizer on a DI before the amp to see if it made a crazy difference, and it totally did. So yeah, this is one of the simplest ways to fix the consistency of the take before it even hits distortion. And if you think about it, a lot of metal players would put compressors before the amp and the chain for this very reason, so it only makes sense that it would work when doing it in the digital world. And if you don't want to get results from clipping, try limiting instead, you know? And if you loved what you just heard, make sure to grab your free trial of JST Maximizer by clicking the link in the description below. But on to our next point. Number 4, editing and gridding. One can assume that if you aren't consistent with your picking hand, that your timing is probably a little sloppy as well. This is another factor of consistency that gets overlooked, but it can easily be remedied. And all you have to do is tighten up the performance a little bit with some slip editing or warping, and you'll have a much better sounding track. Once upon a time, people just had to play things perfectly one time through, and while we should always aim for this in practice, sometimes it's easier to get those rhythms sounding on time with a couple of quick cuts and slip edits. You know, watch how easily this can be done. But perhaps you don't truly understand editing a ton, or you can't find the transients because the track's already been amped like the one we were just using. It's not easy editing amped guitar tracks like that. Well, that brings us to our next point for consistency. And this is when you're not getting a ton of results from the other options up until this point. Just add more gain and distortion. One of the reasons that people use so much distortion in metal is because it's really easy to hide mistakes. The more distorted that something is, the less likely you're going to be able to pinpoint the problems. And that's why so much respect is held for jazz players or even people like Pliny, Ichikanito, and the like, because they play metal-styled progressions through a clean tone, and that's insanely hard to master. But if you have a sloppy take from someone, sometimes the easiest thing to do is just crank the distortion and the gain. You know, we're not gonna sit here and act like people haven't been doing this forever though. It's kind of like when you step into a studio for the first time and you've only ever played through an amp. They turn the amp sim off and you hear the DI and it sounds absolutely terrible. Well, what do you think saves you in that scenario? So just remember, if you're at your wit's end and you've tried everything from quantizing, editing, all the other things that we talked about too, this tends to work as a last resort most of the time, especially if you've already edited the guitar DI. And that's 5, but I'm actually gonna give you one bonus one. But you guys should actually know this already. Limiting at the end of your guitar chain. If your performance isn't meant to be extremely dynamic, putting a limiter at the end of the chain is a way to pin everything down and make it feel really tight. Of course, you don't want to have it hitting a limiter too hard, but just enough to shave some peaks off the top. So now that we've gone over all the other ways to make a guitar consistent, let's summarize. Using a Transient Designer, putting a compressor before the amp, proper picking technique, editing and gridding, just adding more distortion, and a bonus one, limiting at the end of the guitar chain. With all of these in your grasp, I really find it hard to believe that you can't get something workable, even out of the really poorly recorded tracks. I've been in the trenches before, but these are some things that have dug me out of quite a few situations. So please take a stab at it if you feel like consistency is your issue when working with heavy guitars. Do you use any of the techniques that I'm talking about? Do you feel you have a noodly right hand and need to work on that so that you don't have these problems in the future? Leave it in the comments below and I will chat with you fine people, like I always do. If you're an engineer on the come up, give this video a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, you only have to do it one time, and tap that bell for notifications so when a video drops, you know the location. Until next time, I'm out of here. No SM57s today, my friends. Later.